content pruning or content refreshing, when and why we should do it in our SEO processes. This is the topic that we are going to cover today in our session of the Learning SEO Q&A Accelerator with Itamar Blauer. Itamar is the Senior SEO Director at Studio Hawk, who's joining today to go through this topic in which he has tons of experience. Thank you very much, Itamar, for joining our session today.
Yeah, really happy to be here. Thank you, Aleda.
So I'm very excited because actually this is one of the topics that I love to tackle. I have actually created a flow chart about this particular topic in the past because, and Itamar mentioned this in a very accurate way before starting. This is one of those topics that make you think in SEO, make you analyze your content. So there's not right or wrong question here when you are asked, should you refresh your content? It depends on the context. Should you prune your content? Is it actually normal or okay just to eliminate content from your website to rank better even? It's like, and literally the answer is sometimes it is. Sometimes it's beneficial. When it is beneficial and how it can be beneficial, that is our topic today. So to start with it, why refreshing or pruning content when doing SEO? I believe that this goes even beyond SEO, but has to do with the information accuracy, information being up to date on your website. And we will see that, especially when working with a new project, a new website, a new client that hasn't been just released 6 months ago, we will see that these are websites with a wealth of information that were published 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 3 or 2 years ago. And potentially 2 or 3 years ago or 5 years ago, this information was up to date, was up to the point, like it was comprehensive, were researched, highly optimized, well targeted to fulfill the user's needs at that point, and connected well with the customer journey, and connected well with what the users were looking for at that point. But maybe not even because the information is not accurate anymore. Maybe the numbers and the trends and the insights that are shared in the information are still sort of, let's say, evergreen. It's not that the information is not accurate at all anymore, but maybe our competitors, the other players, targeting the same query, are doing much more better, are providing much more insights, are taking the game to another level. Many times then, it's not that we're doing something wrong. Sometimes we do, sometimes it's that the information or the stats that we were sharing from 5 years ago don't make sense at all anymore. These are the obvious cases, of course, that we need to refresh our content, but there are other scenarios in which it's not that the content is bad, it's not that the content is not accurate, it's just that the other competitors, the other players, the other pages ranking or are ranking us for the same query are doing so much better, are providing much more insights, are providing much more meaningful information or content in different formats, different angles that we don't cover, and that Google identifies are better fitted to fulfill the user's need for the query that we want to rank. Then we have also other scenarios in which maybe 5 years ago, the company that published the content were, for example, selling a product line that is not sold anymore at all. So there were terms, there were topics, there were queries that they were targeting 5 years ago. They are not meaningful at all anymore from a content standpoint, but they are still bringing traffic. So what do? You know that is not a goal anymore to rank for this query. It's not helpful from a user experience standpoint to even show this content anymore because you're not selling this content. So how do? Do you just show up 404? Do you redirect? Do you no index? What do you do with it, right? So as we can see, there are so many different scenarios in which it will be advisable or relevant to refresh our content if it is still meaningful for the business, or just kill it because it's not meaningful to target these queries at all anymore. These topics are not meaningful for the queries. And depending on that, depending if the content is well ranking, if it is still bringing meaningful traffic or not, we might want to decide to redirect it or not. Where should we redirect or not? So there are different type of rules. And today, these are the type of criteria and rules that I would like to ask Itamar to move forward with this topic, right? But before going into the steps, into the do's and don'ts, and the criteria to use for this process, Itamar, what are the most common, let's say, scenarios that you have found in which is actually advisable to whether refresh or prune your content? And what are the criteria, let's say, that you take into consideration, into account to say, yes, this is content that needs to be just eliminated for 10, or no, this is content that doesn't need to exist anymore, but we should 301 redirect better to redirect to another more meaningful page, or to the category page, or even the homepage, or no, this is content that is really relevant for the business and it's meaningful to keep updating, so we will refresh.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different routes you can take, and all of that is sort of it's the starting point is the classic SEO it depends angle, where you sort of look firstly into what niche you're in, because certain types of niches would require content to be a lot more heavily scrutinized, or at least be more on top of the content you're producing, and also content that you have produced in the past. So for an example, if you're in the medical field, content that you've got on your site, most likely that information is going to change even like month to month. And a perfect example was COVID, where if you would have had content published in, let's say, Jan and Feb of 2020, and you didn't update it up until maybe the end of 2020, a lot of the information that you may have had there would have been vastly different to what people would have been publishing, or when things change and research is done. So there are certain niches, and this is a good example I like to use, where it's like you do need to assess and understand the context here of actually when your content might need to be updated more or less frequently. Now, in terms of criteria and things you look for, the first thing that you need to understand is the scale of the site. So if you've got a much smaller site with less content, it can be a lot easier to be a bit more manual when you're looking through things. So say, for example, if it's a small site, let's say you're a small B2B site, you've got maybe a few service pages and you've got your blog and your other top level pages. Okay, that's great. You might have maybe 3 service pages, your other top level pages, and then a blog, and you might have maybe 20 blogs. In that sort of scenario, it's a lot easier to go in and manually check through and look at the content you've published all the way throughout from when you started, and be able to say, okay, actually, this is a bit old, we can change this. But when it comes to doing this at scale, and if you want to have a more of a sort of like a one way of doing things sort of approach, then it's best if you crawl the site. So crawling the site is going to pretty much allow you to see all of the URLs are there, but within the crawl, there's going to be different types of configurations that you're going to need to see. And within the crawl configuration, there's lots of settings that you have. So for example, even before you do that, it's like you need to understand the structure of the website. Does it have an easy structure? So say, for example, with content on the blog, are the paths easy to follow? Is it that every blog is housed in a /blog/ type of path? Because if it is, then it's easier when you're crawling to be able to actually silo content into different areas and understand where things lie. If it isn't, it may be harder. But there are still different sort of metrics and settings that you can change. And in terms of the settings, if it's, let's say, a big site and maybe you've got lots of, say, parameter URLs, and you don't want to necessarily have to wait forever to crawl a massive site with loads of these, then you might want to limit the amount of query strings that will show up. And you can do that using, a crawler like Sitebulb or Screaming Frog. So when you have a crawl done, the one thing that I think is really important, because people ask about what it is that you look for. So with the crawl itself, obviously it's going to show you your URLs. You're going to have lots of data and information around the URLs. But I like to personally include some APIs, some third-party APIs linked to the URLs. So the main ones that I would use would be connecting to Google Search Console and to Google Analytics. The reason why I choose Google Search Console is because from the URL level, I want to be able to see in the past 12 months, how many impressions and clicks did that URL have? What was the click-through rate? What was the average position? So when you connect up Google Search Console within your crawl, that's one useful data set that you've got there. From Google Analytics, you can get information about, well, there's actually a lot more you can get, but the main things I look for is if it's B2B, I'll look for maybe conversions. If conversions have been set up correctly on Google Analytics, then I want to be able to see how many conversions have been tied to that particular URL within the past 12 months. If it's B2C and it's an e-com site and you've got your revenue tracking set up, then I'd want to connect the organic revenue to see what that has brought in. So there's different ways to pull in different metrics. So Google Analytics and Google Search Console is great for connecting it together.
I love that you mentioned how when crawling our website, which is something that we do often when analyzing a new website or from time to time to validate the content optimization status of a website, you mentioned integrating the performance metrics, the current rankings, the current traffic, the current conversions, to understand if the content is performing as expected or not. Because maybe when we crawl the pages, we see, oh, this page is not suffering from thin content issues. This page is not suffering from content duplication issues. So it's okay-ish. Well, it's not, because maybe this page, yes, has 5,000 words that are unique, but they are not fulfilling any need. They are fluff, or they were meaningful 10 years ago or 5 years ago, but they are not fulfilling any means. So they are not getting any traffic. They are not getting any rankings. They are not converting anything. And we might find that all of a sudden, half of the pages of the website are like this. And so should we keep these pages at all? What role are they fulfilling at all? Remember that whenever we publish something, I will have content on our website, is because they should fulfill a role. And if Google and users are not seeing them, they are not helping to attract new users or convert new users, what are the role in the customer journey, right? Like, is the information there or the content there fulfilling or all, or implying any sort of goal? Should it be updated? Should it be consolidated or just eliminated? Like, let's analyze this content, right? Another important insight here, potentially also leveraging the Google Search Console. What I will highly recommend too is to go to the Google Search Console and compare with the performance data year over year for the pages, last 3 months, year over year, last 28 days, year over year, and see the page's performance. Those pages that are decreasing in clicks, decreasing in positions, or even decreasing in click-through rate, sometimes they are not decreasing in clicks yet. Google are still ranking them in the same position, but users are not clicking on them anymore. Why? Maybe it's because the competitor that is still outranking them or ranking even below are fulfilling better the need now. Maybe Google is using or showing a search feature that is fulfilling better that role that the page is not yet leveraging, and it should. Maybe the title is not up to date, and you should even reflect better the insights that other players are now showing that you are not, and is your opportunity to refresh that page. So I will highly recommend to do this not only at the beginning of the SEO process, but every at least 6 months, to go and check and review year over year the performance, to understand what are those pages are decreasing in clicks, decreasing in click-through rate, decreasing in position, and well, take a look at what's wrong with them now. Out of date, not relevant information anymore. Is Google now ranking other type of pages for these same queries that they were ranked before? Maybe it's not that they are not even up to date, but maybe for certain queries, an example, Nike shoes. Google used to rank category pages for this query, identify this query to be very commercial. And your listing, your sneakers listing was ranking for this query. And you discover that now the clicks from this query have been decreasing meaningfully. And then you realize, and you go and take a look, that it's not because the content needs to be refreshed. It's not because the content needs to be optimized. No, it's because there is another type of content now that Google is ranking these queries, because they have found that the intent of the user is more informational, more blended than purely commercial. So it's not, in this scenario, it's not about updating or refreshing or optimizing or pruning this page. This page has its role, but shouldn't be targeted to rank for this keyword anymore, for this query. You should create another guide, a guide that is informational. So you identify that opportunity, right? Oh, I need to create another type, another format for of content to target this query now, and this page should be focused on targeting these other queries at this point, not this one. So as you can see, and as Itamar mentioned very well, it takes you in this analysis, content analysis process, in which the outcome can be, it needs to be refreshed because it's out of date. And that is why it's not fulfilling the user search need. And that is why Google is not ranking it as well anymore. Or Google is ranking it as well, but users are not even clicking on it. Or it can be, oh, this content is not meaningful at all to the business anymore. It's not helpful. It's outdated. And oh, all of the sudden, a new team came a year ago and published a new set of articles targeting the same topics. And you have duplication. You have cannibalization. And that is why this content had been derank or decreasing in rankings, decreasing in click-through rate, because there was this new content and nobody realized that these old guides existed. Let's redirect them, 300-word redirect them to refer them to their new versions. So you do this pruning process. Or no, this content existed 10, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, not meaningful anymore. Is showing are showing no index pages or canonicalized URLs. They are not bringing any traffic since 2 years ago, no value at all, etc. Let's fortend them, because there are no backlinks pointing to them, no internal links, no rankings, no traffic, not meaningful at all. Why do we have them? And there's nothing to lose. It's just, we ensure like that Google actually, whenever they crawl our website, they actually see meaningful information, meaningful content. Google doesn't waste its time going through pages that are just canonicalized, no index, showing non meaningful information, showing information that is not helpful. We don't want that. It harms our content overall quality. And that is what we do with this process. But as you can see, different scenarios based on the different outcome of our analysis. And we need to be, well, let's say, aware of our goals, aware of our business context, aware of the nature of the content. And as you can see, it's not one size fits all type of solution. It goes through all of these criteria, and the outcome can be different. What it is important here, and I want to go now, Itamar, with the do's and don'ts, because one of the biggest don'ts that I have seen that a lot of people unfortunately do is like content pruning. If your content is more than 5 years, just eliminate. Just for 10, it's like, oh my God, many of these pages are very likely attracting non-trivial and important backlinks. You don't want just to for 10. You want to at least 300 redirect to their new versions or the categories, and only if this content doesn't make sense to refresh at all anymore. Maybe it's not only about just pruning or eliminating, it's about refreshing, because it might still make sense, even if it has been 5 years, right? So this type of extreme type of recommendations are the ones that really hurt me when I see them, because unfortunately, some people follow them blindly, right? There is a question here, actually, that was left by one of you. Is like, does Google encourage content pruning? What Google encourages is to have up-to-date, helpful information for users. And many times that will go through pruning the content. If the context is meaningful again, if we have a new version of that content, if the content doesn't make sense to showcase anymore because it's not helpful for our users. So it's not about Google endorsing a tactic or not. It's about Google endorsing an experience that should be meaningful, that should be helpful for our users. And that is what we should keep in mind. This pruning or refreshing, these are tactics that will allow us to achieve the goal, right? Itamar, what are the do's and don'ts that you see people doing before going into the actual, let's say, criteria and process that you follow when going through this type of activities?
Yeah, I think it's easier to say what people do that they shouldn't do, because there are different examples, like the one that you said, very valid. You know, if you've got old content, that doesn't mean that it's bad or not helpful. So I think in terms of like the don't is don't just assume that old content is bad. I would say that's a big don't. If we flip it and say do, it means do get the right context. Do look for things like relevance. Because something that I find that people do when it comes to content pruning or refreshing is they might say, if we're going back to the crawl example, they've done a crawl, they've got their metrics there, and they've seen actually there's a piece of content that had loads of clicks, loads of impressions, loads of clicks. But I know for a fact that that piece of content isn't actually relevant to the bottom line of that business. So I'll give you an example. So we've got a client that's a language school, and they had a piece of content on their blog that ranked very well, got loads of traffic, and it was about the meaning of the lyrics behind the Cranberries song "Zombie." So if you guys have heard that song before, so it was a blog post where they talk about the meaning of the lyrics. And I'm like, okay, well, this is great. This gets lots of traffic, but actually, I want to delete it. I don't want that to be on the site anymore because it's not actually relevant to the kind of things that you're trying to push to your users. Because if somebody goes on that blog, most likely they're going to go on it and leave and never come back to the website. They're not going to actually perform the actions that you want. And even looking further, looking into the amount of links that it had as well, then we can say, okay, actually, let's 301 this because there's still a lot of equity we want to maintain and not lose fully, as Aleda was saying before. So I think understanding relevancy is probably the most important thing you can do when it comes to looking at your content, because you might get some metrics that seem good, but are the metrics actually meaningful, or are they actually relevant in terms of, is that page going to lead the user to fulfilling what you intended them to do, is I think another big one. Because even when we're talking about the ways that you can look into content pruning, what Google thinks, and fundamentally, like, Google has had its own sort of ways of looking at it. There was a big story not too long ago about CNET, so a big website, and they came out saying that they actually deleted a bunch of content and they pruned it. And Google representatives sort of came back, and they didn't necessarily say that content pruning was a bad thing, but they just said that you shouldn't just delete content if it's old. So again, it comes to context, it comes to relevance. So I think, do understand the relevance of your content, do understand what the intention is behind everything that you've got there. And if you notice that there's a piece of content, even if it does quite well, if it's not actually relevant to the bottom line and you can't think of a way that it can pass through to a conversion, then I would say that that's not that helpful. And I think as part of that, it's the critical thinking. So be critical when you're looking at this stuff. And this is where sort of Aleda was saying before about stuff you could do with Google Search Console and checking the SERPs, seeing what's actually out there. Obviously, that stuff is absolutely fundamental, but obviously when you're dealing at scale, that's where it can be a bit tricky. So do prioritize. So prioritization is very important, because if you've got a massive site with thousands of pieces of content, you don't have the hours in the day to be able to go individually look at all of these. So what can you do? You can get exports, you can filter to see what the biggest drop-offs have been, and then go.
You can look for patterns too. I mean, you especially when you work with websites with millions of URLs, you don't need to go through every single URL, an example of previously used paginations or photos URLs that were used in the past, and at some point they were left out, published, and just no index. But they keep coming up in your crawls, and you see that they are consuming a lot of crawl budget from Google. Google is crawling a lot of these pages just to not index them. So it's a waste of the crawl, and they can pretty much just be gone, right? Because they don't fulfill a role in the customer journey anymore. They are not attracting backlinks. They are not attracting traffic. Yeah, they are good to be pruned. So you don't need to go every single one of these 15,000 URLs. You just identify that they all follow certain type of URL pattern. They are under a certain directory, under a certain path, and you can coordinate accordingly with the development team. All of these URLs that follow certain paths are not meaningful anymore. You can remove them, or you can all 1 redirect them all in bulk to this new destinations of images that exist now to refer the few visitors that might still come because they have a few backlinks. So it's important that you check if you have internal links, backlinks, traffics, rankings from these pages to decide if it is okay just to kill these pages for 10 them or for them, or if it is meaningful to 301 redirect them somewhere accordingly and update internal links, update, etc., XML sitemaps accordingly, right? But it's, as Itamar mentioned, it's fundamental to understand the role, to try to identify patterns, because you cannot go page by page here, and you need to prioritize those more meaningful pages that are wasting your budget or should be bringing more traffic and have decreased crazily in clicks in the last year, in the last 6 months, and or they have decreasing rankings a lot. So you should focus on prioritize accordingly. Speaking of which, Itamar, what are the steps that you follow for this? What are the criteria that you tend to follow to make the process cost effective?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And part of this is where it can be a bit subjective when you're looking into particular metrics and how you assess what's good and what isn't. Because a number that I might look at and say is bad for one website, it might not be necessarily bad for another website. So in terms of going back to the crawl, when we have a crawl, we see all of our pages. We've added in the third party or the APIs to Google Search Console, Google Analytics, and we've got all of this data. Typically, the things that I look out for is the number of internal links, which we can get from the crawl. I will look for the amount of clicks and impressions that it's had from Google Search Console. I would look into the amount of conversions or revenue from Google Analytics, depending if it's B2B or B2C. And then I will also look for the amount of backlinks. So in order to do that, if we're talking from a tool perspective, so Screaming Frog, I'll be able to do the first parts of this. So the URLs, know what the titles are, other metrics, the number of internal links, connect up Search Console and Analytics, get that data. Backlink data I could get from SEMrush. And then once I have that, I will have filters. So I'll add everything into a filter, and then we're going to look at particular types of things. So if it's a relatively large website, loads of URLs, what I might do is I might look out for pages that have maybe less than 100 impressions in the past 12 months. I might look to see less than maybe 20 clicks in the past 12 months from Search Console. I might look to see if they have less than maybe 5 internal links from the whole site. And I'll also look into crawl depth to see actually how easy or difficult is it for users to even access the content. So if the crawl depth is more than 2, that it takes 3 clicks or more to reach that page, then I might look at that and those URLs that match that criteria, and also ones that maybe have less than, maybe have 0 backlinks, for example. That's another one that I could have. So once I've got those URLs there, I'll probably start with that. Then it's a case of, if I don't actually have enough data there and there's not much that's showing up, then I might go broader a bit with my searches. So maybe instead of it being 100 or less impressions in the past 12 months, I might up it to 200. So until you've got a data set that you can use and you look at the content, obviously as part of content pruning, there's multiple things you could do with that. So you can either decide to yourself, do we get rid of this entirely? Do we just delete this content? Because if you do that, then what you'll probably have to do is either have the redirects in place, or you'll have to go back to see where that old URL has been linked to internally and go in and update those internal links so that they don't redirect. So that's the deleting part. You could also choose to potentially merge 2 pages together. If you see, for example, that there's, from the list that you can see, there's certain content that looks very similar in terms of the URL, or you're thinking maybe it's actually attracting the same thing. From there, what I would do is probably be a bit more manual. So you could go into Google Search Console and actually look at those particular pages to see what queries they've had impressions for. Because if you see that actually the same queries are showing up, or if you flip that and do a search for a particular query and you see that multiple pages have had impressions, then you could say, is there a chance that we could maybe merge this content, these, let's say, 5 URLs, into one URL that is just as comprehensive as it can be just for that one particular query? So that's one of the ways. So we covered the deleting, then you have merging, but also you have improving. So this is typically where you see that your click-through rates are quite low. So Aleda had a great example of actually going into the SERPs and seeing what do competitors have, has the search intent changed? So you can get quite manual with those. But generally speaking, if your click-through rate is quite low and you're getting the impressions, it means that people just aren't clicking on your URL. So it's about seeing what the current title tag is. Is it enticing enough for somebody to click? Obviously, the title tag that you maybe have put or have seen in the crawl, it could be different from what Google is actually displaying, because sometimes it may actually not even use your title tag. It might take it from your H1. So there's been cases of that. So that's where you can sort of look to see, actually, is it something I can do to improve the clickability of the URL in the search results, or is it actually the content that's on the page that I need to improve and refresh? And so you can go in and see when it was last updated. Has there been new information that's come out? So that's the way that I would look in terms of updating the content. So you've got three options pretty much. So once you've got your list, you either choose to delete the content, to merge multiple URLs together, or to update an individual piece of content.
Yeah, I would like to share very, very quickly here. So you can see a little bit the flow chart that I created and go through it quickly, showing a lot of pretty much this criteria that was mentioned by Itamar before. You're seeing the flow chart, right? Perfect. So you can see, and I will be sharing the link in the comments, that this is the logic, right? Like, should you prune or optimize a page from your site? Is the content of a relevant topic for the site targeting valuable queries with search potential whose need you can fulfill with a useful, valuable content offering? Yes or no? If yes, is the page offering the same information of the same nature and or targeting the same queries with the same intent and goal than other pages with the SEO traffic, conversion, or business value? Yes or no? In case there is a cannibalization issue, right? If yes, can the page have a different specific useful role and offering than the others that are also featuring something similar or the same, to individually target relevant, unique, popular search queries to make it worthy to differentiate and optimize its content? If yes, then differentiate and optimize or refresh, right? If not, it's necessary to keep the page enabled as it fulfills a specific functionality, purpose toward the user search experience or business within the site. Yes or no, right? So again, you can, as mentioned by Itamar before, whether optimize or consolidate or just eliminate, right? Like if it doesn't make sense to have it anymore. You can see that here is like the other side of the flow chart with the no as answers. And if it is not driving traffic, not valuable for the business anymore, not meaningful to publish at all, and not even attractive any rankings, traffic, backlinks, or anything, at some point here is even good to 410, right? In this very specific and particular scenario. In other cases, it's better to index follow, because in many cases it does still make sense to leave it, but pass the value to other pages. So in other cases here, you can see that it's better to even canonicalize, right? So again, I am going to share with you the flowchart, but it shows how you need to be doing these meaningful questions regarding the role of the content, the goal of the content, the role not only for SEO to bring traffic, but for the business too, and how meaningful still is, and if it is actually meaningful to put any effort to update or to refresh, or if it is good to just consolidate with all the pages that are already fulfilling that role, right? But it's important to really validate and check. And as you can see, is work that requires time, that requires analysis, and that is why you should do it with care and prioritize and focus on those pages that are actually meaningful, rather than trying to do this with all of the URLs of your website, right? Itamar, to start wrapping up, what are the tools that you use to do this? You mentioned already SEO crawlers with the integration through APIs with Google Search Console, Google Analytics. I also love to use Google Search Console for this and the comparison, the performance data. I love to use SEO testing. In fact, SEO testing already provides you pre-made reports for this. Pages that have decreased in traffic in the last year, in the last 6 months, or pages with poor click-through rate, versus the average. That can be one of those signals to look for. Or pages that haven't been updated in X years, right? Looking on the date of the latest update too. So the tools that can highly facilitate this task for you rather than starting from scratch. Any other tool, any other insights to share that can be useful in this analysis?
Yeah, I think we pretty much covered most of them. So the only other one I would say is something like SEMrush for backlink data that you can then sort of export and use as part of your crawl. But the one thing that I did want to get to very briefly is another question that I saw popped up, and it was around getting buy-in, because I think obviously it's well and good to understand the importance and know how to do content pruning or refreshing, but then it ultimately comes down to being able to convince stakeholders that they should be doing this for the business and for the website. So with that, if I can answer that very briefly, I think it comes down to primarily the concept of quality versus quantity. So if you're in the camp where you're working for a business and they publish loads of content and they say to you, actually, we've got lots of content, which means that it's going to give us the best chances to rank. And that's an argument that happens a lot. Now, for that, I would say that fundamentally, quality is the most important thing. So we mentioned a lot about relevancy before, but quality is the most important thing. And the other thing that I would say that you can use in order to help substantiate your sort of claims or you wanting to go ahead and go through with this is taking a look at the documentation. So Google has documentation around its helpful content system. Now, this is something that has been updated in, I think, very recently, towards the end of last year. But fundamentally, what it talks about there is that Google has site-wide signals. So it's looking at the entire site as a whole, and it basically generalizes it in terms of how helpful or unhelpful the content is on the website. So if you've got lots of content that is there for the sake of it and it's not relevant and it doesn't help users, fundamentally, if that's 90% of your website is just pieces of content like that, that's going to actually harm the 10% of your content that is helpful. And that's written in the documentation as well, so that even helpful content can be negatively impacted if the majority of your site is showing signals of low levels of helpfulness and unhelpful content. So I think that's one of the biggest sort of ways that you can try and get leverage and get buy-in to actually go through with your analysis and go through with this, is actually looking at what Google said around this, which I think is telling. Oh, later you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry about that. So usually the buy-in challenges come whenever whatever you recommend will take a little bit of resources or effort. And that is why the challenges come in, right? Oh, why do you need this in the first place? It's very time consuming to implement. And the best way to do this is show it, test it, prove it. And again, there are tools now that can facilitate this a lot, like SEO testing too. Oh, what happens when you refresh 5 categories? Just start with 5 or 3 meaningful categories that have enough traffic to be able to show the impact right away or very quickly at least. And you do what you're recommended to do with all of them. Show it. So you can compare these 3 categories or 5 categories before and after, and compare with the behavior of all the 5 categories that have the same issue, but that you haven't touched at all. So you can easily show the impact of your recommendations. And it is okay, and it's normal, and it's more than natural that they question, let's say, if something is actually very time consuming to do. That is why it is crucial that you actually recommend stuff that really matters, that you don't only recommend because Google said it, because it's a best practice. No, you are recommending it on the pages that will actually move the needle, that actually make sense for you, that will actually have an impact on your specific goals, right? Because otherwise you will easily fall into the trap that you won't be able to show value, you won't be able to show this proof, and it will eliminate the trust of the client or your bosses on you. You don't want that. You actually want that whatever you recommend is easy to prove, is straightforward to implement, and you prioritize on what is actually meaningful. So thank you very much, Itamar. I really appreciate all of your insights, all of the recommendations that have been very, very actionable. I hope that this has, let's say, at least opened the eyes of many of our audience today for the opportunities or the reason around this and the criteria to take into account when going through this process. I really appreciate the time of everybody. Thank you very much. And remember to subscribe to the channel to avoid missing any new episode, any new session from the Learning SEO Q&A Accelerator. Until the next one. Bye-bye.